Here's a peculiar thing about cruelty. It always feels justified in the moment. People often think that when they act out of bitterness or resentment, they're simply defending themselves, correcting an injustice, or giving someone what they deserve. But rarely do they stop to ask a deeper question. What part of me is taking pleasure in this? See, cruelty is never just about the act, it's about what it reveals. It exposes something dark, something unresolved, something broken within. And the tragic part is that those who indulge in cruelty think they're in control. But they're not. They're being controlled by pain, by envy, by fear, by a hunger for domination masked as justice. What they don't realize is that every time they choose cruelty, they take a step away from the light and toward a place where the air is colder, where meaning decays, where they become a stranger to themselves. Their own cruelty will drag them into darkness. Cruelty is a symptom of internal chaos. Cruelty doesn't just appear. It's not something that emerges randomly in the human soul, like a sudden storm from a clear sky. Cruelty grows, it's cultivated, and more often than not, it grows out of disorder, out of pain, out of unresolved conflict that has never been faced properly. When people lash out at others, when they mock, belittle, sabotage, or manipulate, what they're really doing is broadcasting their inner confusion. It's like a flare fired into the night sky. I don't know who I am. I don't know how to fix it, and I'm taking it out on you. But they won't say that. They won't admit it, because cruelty wears a mask. It cloaks itself in the language of strength. The bully pretends he's just being honest. The bitter coworker says she's just speaking her truth. The abuser says they're just teaching a lesson. But underneath that language is chaos, often deep, ancestral, and unresolved. Cruel people are rarely at peace. They carry within them a storm they refuse to acknowledge. That storm might have come from trauma, rejection, shame, envy, or deep inferiority, none of which are their fault to begin with. But the second they let that pain twist into hatred and project it outward, they become complicit in their own corruption. You've likely seen this before. A person who cannot handle being overlooked begins to sabotage those who succeed. Or someone who's never known affection becomes obsessed with control. They weren't born that way. Somewhere along the line, they let their unhealed wounds rot, and instead of turning inward to confront them, they turned outward to inflict them. There's a tragic irony here. The more someone tries to dominate others through cruelty, the more they are dominated by their own inner mess. The very chaos they refuse to face becomes the master of their behavior. And when that happens, cruelty becomes not just a symptom, it becomes a cycle. One they might even start to enjoy. You can see this in online culture. Anonymity gives people a shield, and from behind it, many feel entitled to spew venom. But this isn't boldness, it's cowardice in disguise. No well-adjusted person goes out of their way to hurt others for sport. The person who enjoys tearing others down is already crumbling inside. They're looking for someone to blame for their own inadequacy. And it's not just online. It happens in offices, families, schools, relationships. The sarcastic jab that wounds a little too deep. The calculated silence that punishes without words. The passive-aggressive comment designed to needle a weakness. These are not just personality quirks. They are alarm bells, signs that something inside is not in order. But here's the hard truth. Internal chaos doesn't stay internal forever. If it isn't confronted, it leaks. And it leaks as cruelty. So what does this mean practically? It means that anyone who finds themselves becoming harsh, vindictive, or quick to judge needs to pause and ask, what's actually going on here? What pain haven't I addressed? What fear am I projecting? That's not weakness. That's the beginning of maturity. And in many cases, it's the first step out of the darkness. Now, this doesn't mean we excuse cruelty, not at all. Understanding the roots of malevolence doesn't mean we allow it to thrive. But if we want to change it, whether in ourselves or others, we need to understand where it begins. And it begins in disorder, in fragmentation, in people who have never properly confronted their suffering. That's why healing matters, not just for personal peace, but to avoid becoming the very thing you once feared or hated. Hurt people don't have to hurt people, but they often will if they're not careful. There's a better way. There's a path that leads through the chaos, not around it. A path of honesty, responsibility, and courage. And those who walk it discover something powerful. That strength isn't found in domination, it's found in restraint. That clarity doesn't come from tearing others down, it comes from building something real within. The cruel person may feel powerful in the moment, but that moment always fades. And when it does, what they're left with is a mirror, and the reflection staring back at them will not be one of power, but of loss. Loss of connection, loss of trust, loss of dignity, because you cannot maintain cruelty without eventually losing yourself to it. So if there's one thing to remember, it's this. Every act of cruelty is a clue that something deeper is broken. And the longer it's ignored, the louder it becomes, until it takes over, until the person who once inflicted pain becomes defined by it. Cruelty then is not strength. It's a signal, a signpost, one that says something is wrong in here, and I haven't faced it. The people who recognize that early, who stop and do the hard internal work, have a chance. They can turn around. They can choose integrity over resentment, truth over domination, light over darkness. But those who don't, well, their own cruelty will drag them into darkness. The unseen cost of malevolence. There is a seductive illusion behind malevolence, the idea that you can get away with it, that if no one catches you, if no one holds you accountable, then the damage doesn't count. That cruelty delivered in secret or under the guise of righteousness comes without cost. But that's a lie, and it's a dangerous one. The most devastating consequences of malevolence aren't external. They don't show up on court records or social media feeds. They show up in the soul, quietly, slowly, but with absolute certainty. When someone deliberately harms another, when they manipulate, betray, humiliate, or destroy for the sake of their own satisfaction, they believe in that moment that they're gaining something. Maybe it's power, maybe it's attention, maybe it's just the twisted pleasure of watching someone else suffer. But what they're really doing is making a trade, short-term control for long-term decay. And that decay always begins internally. You can't deceive your conscience indefinitely, even if you suppress it, even if you bury it under justifications, anger, or cynicism. It knows, you know. There's a part of you, deep, ancient, and honest, that sees what you're doing and keeps score. Maybe not consciously, maybe not even clearly, but that tally builds, and eventually it turns into a weight. That's how people begin to fragment. They carry the burden of what they've done, and the longer they avoid it, the heavier it gets. It shows up as restlessness, as anxiety, as sleeplessness, as irrational anger, as apathy, as addiction. Something inside of them begins to rot, and they don't know why. Or worse, they do know, but pretend they don't. Because here's the truth. Every act of malevolence chips away at the self. You become smaller, less integrated, less alive. You can see this happen in people. Someone starts down a dark path. Maybe a little lie, maybe a betrayal, they think, doesn't matter. And they get away with it. So they keep going, they rationalize, they deflect, they put on a mask, pretending to be someone they're not. But the cracks start to show, relationships fall apart, trust dissolves, their creativity dries up, their capacity for joy shrinks, they become cynical, suspicious, paranoid, and eventually they stop trusting even themselves. Because deep down they know they're not who they claim to be. They know they've become something twisted, something hollowed out. And that's the ultimate cost of malevolence. You lose the ability to be whole. Not right away. At first, there's excitement in the manipulation, a thrill in getting away with something. But that thrill fades. And when it does, what's left is emptiness, numbness, and eventually despair. People who build their lives on cruelty, whether in relationships, business, or ideology, end up isolated, not just physically, but existentially, because you can't build connection on a foundation of harm. You can't experience love if you see others only as tools. You can't find meaning if everything you touch is reduced to strategy and control. Eventually, the person who practices malevolence for long enough becomes surrounded by the consequences of it. People start to leave. Or worse, they stay but with resentment and distance. No one truly opens up to someone they fear. No one shares their soul with someone who might use it against them. And so the malevolent person, in all their scheming, ends up alone. Powerful maybe, but profoundly alone. And what do you do when you've built a life of victories, but no one trusts you? When you've won the game, but lost the ability to feel anything real? That's a tragedy. There's another cost too, a deeper one. The psychological structure of a person begins to collapse when their words and actions become misaligned with truth. The psyche needs integrity. It needs coherence. If your inner world is at war with your outer behavior, eventually something breaks. That's when people fall into depression, anxiety, compulsive behavior. Not because life is hard. Life is always hard, but because they've twisted themselves into something unnatural, something false, and no amount of success, praise, or distraction can cover that up. That's why accountability matters. That's why conscience matters. It's not to make you feel guilty. It's to keep you sane, to keep you human. When you ignore that inner signal, that sense of I shouldn't be doing this, you're not just breaking a rule, you're breaking part of yourself. So the question becomes, what kind of person do you want to be? Not in public, not on paper, but in the moments when no one is watching, in the silence when your conscience speaks. And there's nowhere to hide, because that's where character is forged. And that's where the price of malevolence is either paid or avoided. Some people live their entire lives chasing power, pleasure, revenge, only to reach the end and realize they traded everything meaningful for things that don't last. They spent their years climbing a ladder only to find it was leaning against the wrong wall. So here's the call. Don't fall for the illusion. The real cost of malevolence is not what happens to others. It's what happens within you. You don't get away with it, not really. Every time you act with cruelty or manipulation, you're not just damaging your target, you're reshaping yourself. You're carving out pieces of your soul to maintain an illusion of control. And if you do that long enough, you'll have nothing left but the shell. So choose carefully, choose honesty, choose restraint, choose the hard, noble path of becoming someone who builds rather than destroys, who confronts darkness rather than spreading it. Because malevolence is a fire, and the first thing it burns is you. Darkness doesn't arrive loudly, it creeps. Yeah. If there's one thing people rarely understand about darkness, true darkness, it's this. It doesn't kick down your door. It doesn't show up in a costume, horns flashing, demanding your soul. No. Darkness is subtle. It's slow. It's patient. It whispers before it ever shouts. And that's why it's so dangerous. Most people imagine that evil looks obvious, that they'll recognize it right away, like some Hollywood villain twisting a mustache in a thunderstorm. But that's a fantasy. In reality, the path into darkness begins with a compromise, a lie, a grudge, a refusal to speak the truth when you know you should. And because nothing explodes immediately, you tell yourself, it didn't matter. So you do it again and again. And slowly your standards shift. You become numb to the guilt. Your justifications become smoother, sharper. You begin to believe the story you tell yourself. That you're not lying. You're just protecting the truth. That you're not bitter, just realistic. That you're not cruel, just tired of being nice. You reframe your dissent as evolution. And that's when the danger sets in, because now you think you're in control, but you're not. What you don't realize is that every time you betray what you know to be right, just a little, you're giving up ground, not to someone else, but to something else, a part of yourself that doesn't care about truth, that doesn't care about integrity, that wants comfort at any cost, that wants revenge instead of justice, that wants control instead of relationship. That part grows in silence, not in the big moments, but in the small, forgettable ones. The half-truths, the withheld apologies, the silent judgment, the moments when you knew better and did it anyway. That's how darkness creeps in, inch by inch, thought by thought, until your sense of who you are has shifted so gradually, you don't even notice the change. You start to laugh at cruelty. You start to see people as obstacles. You start to prefer being feared over being respected. And then one day you look in the mirror and see a face you barely recognize, not because it's scarred, but because it's hollow. The light is gone, not extinguished all at once, but smothered by your own choices. The tragedy is that most people never set out to become that. No one wakes up and decides, I want to be bitter. I want to be selfish. I want to ruin everything good in my life. That's not how it works. People drift. They slide. They surrender a little too often and for a little too long. And then they look up and realize they've become a stranger to themselves. Because darkness doesn't demand that you leap, it only asks that you lean. And when you do, when you inch toward it enough times, it eventually takes hold, not with violence, but with familiarity. Because by then, it's your home. You've trained your mind to live in the shadows, to twist good into weakness, to call cynicism wisdom, to find comfort in detachment. And now the light feels alien, unreachable, even threatening. And maybe the worst part? It still lets you smile, still lets you function, still lets you pretend everything's fine. But beneath that surface You're living with a fracture. Something in you is out of sync. And the longer you ignore it, the wider the crack grows. So, how do you stop the drift? How do you resist that slow descent? You start with the little things. You speak the truth, even when it's inconvenient. You apologize when you're wrong. You stay silent when you're tempted to speak in cruelty. You tell yourself the truth before you tell anyone else. And you hold the line not because it's easy, but because every inch matters. People think the battle between light and darkness is some dramatic war played out on stages and battlefields, but more often it's a quiet war, waged in the privacy of your own heart. It's fought in the decision to forgive when resentment feels justified, in the refusal to gossip, in the commitment to humility when your ego screams for validation. Those are the battlegrounds that determine who you become. Because character doesn't collapse in a day. It erodes, it fades. And it takes constant attention to keep yourself aligned. That's not paranoia, it's discipline. Because if you don't stand guard at the gates of your mind, something else will walk in and take residence. And it won't announce itself, it will take your shape, wear your smile, use your voice, and slowly empty your life of meaning. That's how people end up successful but miserable. That's how relationships fall apart without anyone noticing when the damage began. That's how empires crumble, not in explosion, but in rot. So here's the hard truth. If you're not actively walking toward the light, you're probably drifting toward the dark. There is no neutral ground in the soul. The heart doesn't stay clean by accident. You have to fight for it. And that fight begins when you stop romanticizing the fall. When you stop assuming that if something hasn't exploded, it hasn't infected. When you realize that your tiny compromises matter more than your grand declarations. Because the descent into darkness is almost always silent. But it is not harmless. And if you let it creep far enough, long enough, it will own you, quietly, fully, completely. So guard your thoughts, watch your words, stand for what you know to be right, especially when it's inconvenient. Because the only way to stay in the light is to choose it again and again in 1,000 tiny moments that no one but you will ever see. Because while darkness may creep, so can virtue. Let it. Truth and responsibility are antidotes. When a person begins to slip into cruelty, when resentment becomes habit, and when bitterness starts to define their view of the world, there are only two things that can truly pull them back: truth and responsibility. Not comfort, not distraction, not revenge masked as justice. Truth is painful. That's why people avoid it. It forces you to see things you'd rather ignore. Your failures, your jealousy, your weakness, your role in the suffering around you. But it's also clarifying. And in a world thick with self-deception, clarity is freedom. You can't heal what you won't face. You can't correct what you won't name. And so the longer someone avoids the truth about themselves, about what they've done or what they've become, the deeper the darkness grows. It feeds on lies, even small ones. Responsibility is even harder. It demands that you stop blaming, that you stop waiting for someone else to fix it, that you carry the weight of your own existence, no matter how heavy. But here's the paradox: the more you take on, the stronger you become. People think avoiding responsibility makes life easier. It doesn't. It makes you weaker. And weakness breeds resentment. And resentment, unchecked, becomes cruelty. If someone is spiraling into bitterness, the first question they need to ask isn't who hurt me? It's where have I been lying to myself? The second is what am I avoiding that I should be carrying? Because those two questions are weapons against darkness. People often imagine that strength looks like dominance, winning arguments, being feared, getting the last word. But real strength is something else entirely. It's telling the truth when it costs you. It's stepping up when no one else will. It's confronting your own darkness before you point fingers at anyone else's. When you start doing that, when you live with truth and responsibility at the center, you become someone that darkness cannot control. Because it no longer has leverage. It can't seduce you with lies because you've chosen to see clearly. It can't tempt you with power because you've chosen purpose instead. That's how people rebuild. Not by seeking comfort, but by facing the uncomfortable, by speaking truth into the places they used to keep silent, by carrying what is theirs to carry even when it's hard. And it is hard, but that's the point. Truth and responsibility won't make your life easier, but they will make it meaningful. They will anchor you, and they will shield you from becoming what you hate. Cruelty is the product of a life lived in evasion. Truth and responsibility, they're the way out. The final judgment comes from within. People live as if judgment is always external. They fear being exposed, caught, humiliated. They think if they avoid scandal, stay out of trouble, or win enough admiration, they've won. That if no one sees the damage they cause, if no one calls them out, they're safe. But the harshest judgment doesn't come from society. It comes from within. There's a part of you that's always watching, a part that knows when you're lying, when you're betraying yourself, when you hurt someone just to feel powerful or stayed silent when truth was required. That part doesn't forget. You might distract yourself with noise, accomplishments, or validation, but it waits. And over time, it begins to speak. At first, it's just a whisper, a moment of discomfort you brush off, a feeling you can't name. But if you keep ignoring it, it grows. It shows up in the unease you feel before sleep, in the moments of silence that suddenly feel threatening, in the subtle shame you carry in your posture, your tone, your choices. And eventually it speaks louder than anything else. This is the reality people miss when they think they've gotten away with something. You don't escape the consequences of cruelty just because no one saw it. You still have to live with yourself, and your mind, your conscience, your very soul, they keep score far more honestly than the world ever could. That's why people unravel. Not because they were exposed, but because they became internally divided. Because the distance between who they are and who they pretend to be became unbearable. That's where anxiety and depression often begin, not in tragedy, but in misalignment. A life built on lies may stand for a while, but eventually the foundation collapses from the inside out. This is why external success means nothing if it comes at the cost of internal integrity. You can be praised by millions and still hate yourself. You can be feared, envied, even worshipped, and still know deep down that you've built something false, that everything around you is just a shield to protect you from that quiet, ever-present voice saying, "You know what you did." And that voice won't be silenced with applause. There is only one way to quiet it: truth, repentance, change. owning what you've done and taking responsibility for who you become next, not because the world demands it, but because your soul does. That's the only path forward that leads to peace. Because you can trick the world, but you cannot trick yourself, not forever. People who walk the path of cruelty eventually find themselves alone, not just physically, but spiritually, cut off from meaning, cut off from real connection. Because the final punishment for malevolence isn't external judgment, it's living in a mind that can't rest, in a heart that can't love, in a body that carries the weight of everything you refuse to face. So, live in a way that when you're alone, truly alone, you feel whole, not proud necessarily, but honest, integrated, at peace. Because long after the world forgets your name, long after the noise fades and the lights go out, you'll still be there. And what you built inside, that's what will remain.